everyone. Thank you for joining us. Sorry for the hiccup. Thank you for joining us for Creatures and Cosmology of the Casas Grandes world with Doctors Christine and Todd VanPool. I'm Maggie Onosorgan. I'm the new Public Programs and Relations Manager here at the Ameren Museum. And before we begin our program, I would like to acknowledge that the Ameren is located in southern Arizona on lands where the Otham, Hopi, Oshwe, Yoeme, and Apache families lived for untold generations, and whose wisdom and traditions live on today in vibrant communities. We are grateful for what all of these communities, rich in history, have to teach us. We would also like to thank our members and donors who enable the Ameren to provide this free online programming and fulfill Ameren's mission to foster and promote the knowledge and understanding of the Native peoples of the Americas through research, education, conservation, and community engagement. To learn how you can assist the Ameren in supporting its mission and programmings by becoming a member or donor, please visit ameren.org. On Saturday, April 1st at 11 a.m., Ameren will host a free online artist talk, The Artist and the Patron, a candid conversation with jeweler Dwayne Moctama from Hopi and Laguna Pueblos and longtime collector Joanne Conrad. On April 29th at 11, we will host Dr. Michael Searcy speaking on New Insights into the Old Period in Casas Grandes, 10 years of Viejo period research in northern Mexico. Please watch for these and other upcoming events on Ameren's Facebook page or website, ameren.org, for registration and details. And now I'm pleased to introduce our speakers. Dr. Christine VanPool grew up in Ruidoso, New Mexico. She earned her Bachelor of Science in Anthropology at Eastern New Mexico University and her Master's and PhD at the University of New Mexico. In 2006, she joined the anthropology faculty at the University of Missouri-Columbia. Over the last 20 years, her main research focus has been on archaeology, method, and theory as it pertains to religion and pottery symbolism in the Casas Grandes world. Since 2007, she has been co-directing museum and field projects in northern Mexico and southern Arizona and New Mexico with her husband and colleague, Dr. Todd VanPool. Todd VanPool earned his BA in religion and anthropology at Eastern New Mexico University and his master's and PhD in anthropology from the University of New Mexico. He is also a professor of anthropology at the University of Missouri-Columbia. Todd's research has focused on the archaeology of the ancient North American Southwest, especially the late prehistoric occupation of the Casas Grandes region of Chihuahua, Mexico, and southernmost New Mexico. An emerging focus of his research is cross-cultural patterns in the use of trance-based religious experiences. Along with Christine, he is exploring how trance can be initiated with and without entheogens such as tobacco, peyote, ayahuasca, and datura. He has written many articles and publications, including one titled Social Interactions, Social Status, and the Organization of Medio Period Craft Production, which relates to this presentation. So if you would like to ask any questions during the program today, please type your questions in the Q&A chat box. We will gather those questions to share with our speakers at the end of their presentation. Also, a link to this recording of today's program will be sent to the Zoom registrants. And now I'm happy to turn it over to our speakers, Dr. Christine and Todd VanPool.
We sure are grateful to be here. And thank you, Maggie, for introducing us and allowing us to be here, and also for Annie Larkin for inviting us and working with us as we worked towards this presentation. We also want to acknowledge Rachel Mueller, who is one of our rising undergraduates at the University of Missouri, who is doing some good work. We're going to be relying on her research as part of this. She's looking at the groundstone from Paquimé and more generally from across the Casas Grandes region. So we'll go ahead and get started. If I can advance the slide. Okay, we're good to go now. Thank you. So we've got a couple of goals here. We're going to be talking about what is called local knowledge in anthropological literature and how that relates to the Casas Grandes people. And we're going to be using that to look at how animals relate to the cosmology and the structure of Casas Grandes iconography. Our basic framework here is using what's called cognitive archaeology. Cognitive archaeology is basically a framework in which we recognize that humans are both similar and different. We're similar in that we have very similar minds. Humans have human minds as opposed to dog minds or cat minds or something like that. We also have human bodies, and that creates similar ways in the way that we think, the way we approach the world, aspects of our behavior. There's also, of course, culture that leads to differences within humans and human behavior. So cognitive archaeology looks at the similarities that are created by the fact that we are human, and then examines the differences that are created as culture modifies our behavior, and in fact modifies our bodies and our minds as well. One of the things that cognitive archaeology has shown is that all humans, not every individual human, but all human cultures, use hierarchical classification for understanding aspects of the world. Now, not every aspect of every classification is hierarchically organized, but all human cultures do use hierarchical classifications to try to understand the world and to categorize the world, because we want to interact with our world effectively, be able to understand what's going on around our world. Now, we're, of course, familiar with this in terms of scientific analysis. The Linnaean taxonomic system, which is reflected there on the right, is a hierarchical classification system that goes from domain on down to species and categorizes all the different sorts of critters and plants and whatnot out in the world. Those of you who are archaeologists will probably recognize this sort of a flow chart, this hierarchical classification. This is from William Andrzejewski's excellent book on stone artifact analysis, but archaeologists use these sorts of frameworks all the time to type stone artifacts or ceramic artifacts or various, even cultures. We use this basic structure. A hierarchical classification allows us to understand and work with the world. Of course, we also use these sorts of classifications outside of scientific analysis. For example, the paper is typically organized using a hierarchical classification in different sections and different parts of different sections. And every time you go to the the supermarket, you're going to be running into these sorts of hierarchical classifications. Here's an example of cosmetics, but every section of the store is organized in very similar ways, hierarchically organized. What we do with hierarchical classification is also done by other cultures around the world. Out of this comes local knowledge, and local knowledge is the way that people interact with their daily life, with the things that are around them. And so it tells them what they can eat and what they can't eat, and how they need to prepare food and how not to prepare food. It tells people how to interact with technology, what sorts of technologies are appropriate at certain times, what sorts of technology you ought not to use under certain circumstances. It also integrates things like spirits and kin and ancestors into frameworks that help people interact with their environment, interact with each other, and have some control over their life. Clifford Geertz wrote a very influential book about local knowledge, and we've got a picture of that there. But it's important to kind of think of local knowledge as the way that people are able to ground themselves with common sense based on their culture, what common sense is within their culture, and avoid the sorts of difficulties, but also allow for their growth, their success within a cultural framework. So if you look there on the far right, there's an excellent book there talking about sensing disaster and how people will use local knowledge to try to navigate the difficulties that are present within the world. If you look at the image there in the center, you see a lot of people doing a lot of different things. Every single aspect of that reflects local knowledge in some way. The sorts of houses one uses, the sorts of activities that are performed within certain parts of a house, the sort of technology that's used for fishing, the sorts of fish that one might capture and how they might be prepared, the sorts of ways to gather wild resources and how to interact with other people. All of that is tied together within a system of behavior. We, of course, use this, but so do other people. Local knowledge, in turn, leads to folk taxonomies. And folk taxonomies are simply the ways that people organize the animals around them, and plants as well, but here we're going to be focusing on animals. We got two critters here. These are, within my perspective, nuisance animals. If you live in Missouri like we do, the possum and the raccoon are notorious for getting into trash and causing lots of trouble. We had one move into our garage briefly, and it was a pain in the neck. I don't much care for these critters, but they're very common and they're nuisance animals. And so they're clustered together as nuisance animals. But when we look at these critters in a scientific framework, a Linnaean framework, we understand that the opossum there is actually a marsupial and more closely related to kangaroos. And the raccoon there is a mammal that is more closely related to, it's a placental mammal that's more closely related to even whales compared to the possum. So the upshot is that within the scientific taxonomy, these are very different creatures with very different evolutionary backgrounds. But within my folk taxonomy, they're both very annoying to me, and therefore they're called nuisance animals. Some people actually like raccoons as pets, and again, that's not consistent with my experience. But for some people, a raccoon might even be a pet animal, and in the same category as dogs and cats and other sorts of critters. These sorts of folk taxonomies can include a lot of cosmological and behavioral information. And so here's an example from Islam. But the sorts of meat that people can eat, the sorts of meat that people cannot eat, is reflected and reflects cosmological and spiritual aspects of the various animals, the unclean animal versus the animals that can be eaten. For example, bats are haram and geese are halal. And I think that, as our recent history has shown, eating bats is in fact a very bad idea. So I'm all for that. But the idea here is that the folk taxonomies can actually organize our the way that we approach the world, the way we conceive the world, and how we interact with resources beyond just simply, hey, here's this animal. It loads those animals with meaning that go beyond, there's a dog, there's a cat, the dog being an unclean animal, for example, amongst many Arab cultures. Within this framework, we actually wrote an article about this back in 2009. But within this framework, we get different sorts of correspondences. So a one-to-one correspondence would reflect a folk's taxonomy that identifies what we might consider a species or a genus. And there's a consistency there, that the same criteria are being used to recognize this sort of critter and that sort of critter in both a Western scientific framework and in a folk taxonomy. And so, for example, dogs and cats are different animals. That would be a one-to-one correspondence in the sense of there's a category that would correlate with dog, category that would correlate with cat. They're different animals. Under differentiation, though, is where there might not be a distinction within the folk taxonomy that a Western taxonomy might make. So, for example, a lot of times in folk taxonomies, ants are simply considered ants. But in scientific taxonomies, we have literally thousands of different species of ants. So that would be a case where the folk taxonomy simply recognizes ants, whereas the scientific taxonomy recognizes distinctions that are not important to the people as they're going about in their daily life. Over-differentiation type 1 is a situation where there's a single scientific Western taxonomy, but folk in their folk taxonomy differentiate between those. So, for example, a tadpole versus a frog, those are frequently considered different creatures in folk taxonomies, but within a scientific taxonomy, they're just different life stages of the same critter. Maggots versus flies is another one that's very common, where those are differentiated within folk taxonomies, but are considered the same within a scientific taxonomy. Then over-differentiation type 2 is where it's kind of higgledy-piggledy, for want of a better term, where there's not a particularly good correspondence between the taxons that are identified within a scientific framework and the taxons that are identified within the folk taxonomy. What we're going to do here is kind of use this approach to start and look at the nature of the animals that are portrayed in ceramics and in stone in the Casas Grandes region during the Medio period, and that's from about 1200 to 1450. So we're going to be looking at how people organize their folk taxonomies, and from that, attempt to gain knowledge about the local knowledge that people are using to interact with their environment and with each other, and cosmological concepts or precepts that are going to be underlying these relationships. And so you see the beautiful pictures there with the macaw heads and whatnot, and then that nice little copper turtle there and a bear. I believe that those are actually still on display at the Amrand. This is a picture of replicas that were on display at the Amrand, and I think they're still there.
At least for the copper tinkler and the stone artifact. The pottery is authentic and is original pottery.
Fair enough. Yeah, excellent.
I took those pictures. I was at the Amrand in 2018, and it was a wonderful time, and they allowed me to take lots of pictures, and we'll be looking at those today.
So our question here then is, what can we learn about Medio period local knowledge from the folk taxonomy? So the Medio period itself is focused in northern Chihuahua, a little bit of southern New Mexico, a touch of Arizona, on over into eastern Sonora. And so it's a fairly large chunk of the prehistoric North American Southwest. It's The single largest site is this place called Paquimé that's indicated there by that star. And I suspect that many or perhaps all of you are aware of Paquimé. The Amrand, of course, has a rich history in terms of research there at Paquimé under leadership of Charles Peso and his colleagues, Eduardo Contreras and others. The entire region is characterized by this beautiful polychrome pottery. And I know that Southwestern archaeologists and archaeologists who are focused in Northwestern Mexico talk a lot about how beautiful their pottery is, but not to be too humble here, but frankly, the Casas Grandes culture has the prettiest pottery in the entire region. It's just beautiful, and I'll put it up against anybody else's pottery. It's just gorgeous with these beautiful colors, this exceptional work. It's just gorgeous. This is Paquimé. Paquimé is a very large site. Has a lot of ceremonial architecture as well as places where people are living. There's that little West Mexican turtle that we were talking about previously. That's made out of copper, probably imported from West Mexico. Also have shell from over in the coast of California and farther down into West Mexico. Grand architecture, this beautiful architecture that's overbuilt. So it's built to be impressive. It's about 3 stories tall, perhaps even taller in some locations. When the Spanish came through the Southwest as part of the Entradas, they encountered Paquimé, and the historical documents describe its beauty as comparable to ancient Rome. It had beautiful mosaics, had beautiful murals on the walls. Unfortunately, there was an earthquake in the early 1900s that damaged it considerably, and then just simply the impact of the environment and the impact of people have caused the site to receive considerable damage. But it is a heck of a site. It's one of the World Heritage sites, and it's just an impressive place. If you get a chance, we encourage you to go and visit it. It's something special. There's a lot of evidence of West Mexican influence from the Aztlan culture. Here's a ball court, similar to the Mesoamerican eye-shaped ball courts. But what we have there at Paquimé reflects a lot of influence from West Mexico, as well as local influence from the Members region and from the preceding VAO period. And so it's kind of a crossroads or a location where lots of people took different ideas from different locations and then put them together in very interesting ways. So we're interested in trying to understand the structure of this culture, the local knowledge here, as reflected in the iconography. I'm going to turn it over to Christine here.
Okay, so a lot of this is in my dissertation, at least this first part of this discussion. So in the mid 1990s and early 1990s, I went around to 5 different museums and I took photographs of pottery. And when I got around to number crunching the ceramic iconography, I found that for representational, what we might call art, was the human effigies, and Todd and I have written quite a lot on that, and I invite you to any of those, and I can answer a question about those later. But we're not talking about those today much, unless they relate to the animals. But what I found was there were a lot of birds in the iconography, and then a lot of snakes. The archaeological evidence at Paquimé is, yes, there are a lot of birds at Paquimé. They were often sacrificed and richly interned, and so it's a case where what we're seeing iconographically in the ceramic data looks like what's going on in the site, which is good, at least for the birds. The snakes, however, we don't have a lot of evidence of where the snake bones were found or what they were being used for. Part of that is because De Peso and everyone's excavation didn't do floats and the sort of things we do today that we could look at the snake bones. So there are a little bit, some mysteries yet to be unraveled with how snakes are being used and handled at Paquimé, but we'll go on to that. What we find using folks' taxonomy and this type of taxonomic system related to scientific taxonomy is sometimes Casas Grandes potters are like, yeah, that pot looks pretty close to the perfect stick. We've got it, and we really see this in these type of one-to-one correspondence with many of the birds, often the snakes. And then from there, it gets a little more suspect because we have other things going on with under differentiation and over differentiation. And we'll talk about that in just a second. This is a great one-to-one correspondence on the top of this bottle, stirrup spout bottle. It's definitely a killdeer. It has 9 of the 14 characteristics that modern biologists would use to key out the killdeer. Of course, this is black and red pottery, but the black we can see is the brown cap on top of the killdeer. It also, and we'll see another angle of this vessel in a second, has a rust red rump. It has the distinctive neck bands, chest collars, the white collars, the brown cap, and a white belly and breast. We see this as well. Looking on the backside, that rust red rump under the tail feathers is very prominent. What I found really fascinating about this one is anybody who knows anything about killdeer, they can be really quite loud. They are often associated with Native Americans as water birds, and they nest on the ground. They lay 4 eggs. And so as a predator comes upon their nest, the killdeer will do what they call the killdeer broken wing display. So it flops around, screams, and says, hey, I'm injured. Come follow me. Let's go. And it will drive the predators away from the nest. What's curious about this ceramic effigy, if you look at that, those wings are not symmetrical. I think that was a deliberate design of the potter to show the broken wing display. So you have what we call key traits and how the bird looks morphologically, but also what is probably being displayed as a broken wing display. And again, these people knew their natural environment extremely well, and this is a wild bird. It wasn't kept in captivity like the macaws at Paquimé, but we see it on top of this vessel. What's really amazing to me is Polychasma suggested that these spades, and especially a half spade, was emblematic of the horned serpent, but Gloria Finner said it's the macaw serpent. It's a little bit iffy, and we'll see in a little bit that we have feathered macaw serpents at Paquimé, but we also have a lot of macaws. These are interred into deliberate burials. There is just one burial where these birds were deliberately had their necks broken, turned in, and then laid out in fans. Usually there are 4 red scarlet macaws to 1 military macaw being placed in these burials. DePeso found on average that there was 4.1 to 5 birds per these half fan burials. This to me looks like an actual representation of a macaw burial that would have happened at Paquimé. So we have the wild bird on top, but also a ritual pattern of ritualized bird sacrifice on the bottom of this vessel. Another curious thing about the artist is things that we could find in our natural environment, touch and feel, like the killdeer, is in form. So humans are often in form in 3-dimensional forming, whereas something that's a little more abstract, the ritual around the macaw burial, is painted in negative on the pottery. We see this with the horn-plumed serpent. It is always painted on pottery. It's not done in 3-dimensional form. Things that we might call tutelary birds or anthropomorphic images are painted in the pottery. They're not done in 3D. So we see some sense of, we have the stuff in the natural world, but more of that spiritual dimension or other realm that people can see in the right circumstances on the pottery. So we're seeing the macaws. Macaws, as I bet most people in this room know, are big news. The people at Paquimé raised them, they handled them, they brought them in from elsewhere, they kept them. I absolutely love the Animate Museum. When I toured it in 2018, I like this nesting box with the mascot of the Animate Museum with the little stuffed macaw sitting out. It also shows the rings of how these were held into the adobe architecture, because the macaws will peck at that adobe. They really want out. And so it's called a macaw plug, is that stone that goes in it. If we look at a lot of the iconography of the macaws, they look like they have a ring out of them. So it's almost like the vessel itself is the nesting box with their head peeking out. One of the things is, we're not going to spend a lot of time talking about macaws because we have publications on them. Polychasma, Paul Minnis, and many people have a lot of publications.
Mike Whalen recently.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Todd. Lots of publications on them. But after handling I literally thousands of Casas Grandes pots in my life. I got to the Amarin in 2018. And this was really curious to me because in the museums that I've traveled in, often the lower mandible is broken on the macaws. They're not intact. And I kept wondering, what is causing them? It's just not a design flaw. I think something more was going on. So I was talking with Christine Suter and I told her, wow, this is so cool. And if I remember correctly, this is a piece of copper in it. And so this thing, when I picked it up to photograph it, it rattled. I was really excited because they're probably, the birds are being given tinklers and probably things to get their attention as probably women. I agree with Christine Suter that women are handling these. The iconography shows as well. But it's interesting that they made part of their design for the macaw to rattle on these vessels. Notice that they're in double-headed. The effigies always tend to occur in pairs with the macaws. There are military macaws in the burials at Paquimé and mostly the scarlet macaws. The military macaws are green. And a couple years ago, Todd and I suggested that the black paint can be read sometimes as green. And I think that this one, the black-headed macaw, is a military macaw, whereas the red-headed is a scarlet macaw. This fits really nice with Stephen's Plog's work in Chaco and elsewhere, where he suggests sometimes the black paint can be red green. I agree with that. And I think this is one of those evidential pieces that we can assume that this is true for the Casas Grandes world. Again, we're seeing the double-headed. One of the things about Medio period iconography is the artists love to do things in pairs and duality over and over. So you get pairs of birds, you get pairs of snakes, all kinds of pairing going on. What I like about this is also you can see that on the side, this is the macaw stone, like what you get in the nesting, round nesting in the bird nest. This is also that round ring around the macaw, but also these look very much like flowers. Mike Mathewis and others have suggested these might be flowers. I completely agree with that. And I think this is also more evidence to Todd and I's original work with these being related to the flower world. We also find a really important icon over and over that a friend of ours, Ken Corkada, suggests as a double-headed diamond macaw motif. They're also spinning. They seem to have something about them. They are so important. We find hundreds of macaws at Paquimé. We find them richly interred, but we also find them as this symbol, and it looks like they're rotating around. And so I suggested in my dissertation that these are sunbirds, and this fits both Puebloan and Mesoamerican idea of sunbirds back in 2003 and in 2001 when I first was looking at these. Maria Sprin suggests that the center of that diamond is a textile. I think Maria Sprin is spot on too. I think those are something to do with the textile and the formation of these type of beliefs in the Casas Grandes world. Iconographically, this is a female effigy pot. If we were to turn her face forward, you would see she is clearly a female holding a bowl. She has the primary sexual characteristics of a female, but on her back is the double-headed diamond macaw. Todd and I did another statistical analysis in American Antiquity in 2006. We find, statistically speaking, women are associated with macaws. Women also take care of children. And we also see that this is a pan-Southwest phenomenon. In the Members earlier period, AD 1000, we see women handling birds with a male. Women probably are carrying them up. We also see at Pottery Mound going up toward Albuquerque, New Mexico, the corn maidens holding the birds. They probably are being used to help with as sunbirds, pets of both the corn mating and the sun for water making rituals. Todd and I have suggested that Paquimé is symbolically a water city. They are doing everything to keep water at Paquimé, going from reservoirs to canals, and they're doing rain-making ceremonies. And so this is part of that phenomenon.
Just as a point of interest for anybody who might be interested in more in the macaws, Christopher Schutz and Pat Gilman and Stephen Plog have a recent book published in 2022 by the Amarin Foundation dealing with macaws. The Sunbirds of the Southwest is my recollection of the title. It's got some really good articles in there, and Polly Shafsma has a outstanding discussion of a lot of this imagery with it as part of that book.
Thank you, Todd. Okay. We also find as part of these birds, there are not as many owl effigies as there are macaw effigies, but we have two types of owls being portrayed in the Casas Grandes Medio period iconography. One is clearly the horned owls. Their brackets around the face don't come all the way through, and they have horns, so they're very distinctive from a Linnaean system. We also have the barn owls, which have the full bracket around the face that we see on the right hand. Owls, for most of the Americas, and especially in North America, is kind of a tricky thing to think about symbolically. Many groups consider these messengers of death. They're dangerous. They're night predators. Shamans use them. The Zuni, historically, only the war chiefs could use them and handle them. They were important for feathers. And so sometimes they're bad omens, sometimes they're good, sometimes they're used in warfare. We suggest in our 2009 paper that they're associated with night and they're predator birds with shamanic sensibility. The fact that they're depicted over and over in iconography means that there's something important to them, probably dealing with night and religious beliefs at that level, cosmological, probably with war captains, if we were to take a wild guess. Interestingly, these are not these double-headed like the macaws, and we'll see later snakes tend to be double-headed or rotating around each other. Perhaps these are quail. These are appearing in museums. They come straight out of the vessel wall. It's really hard to pin down beliefs for these in the American Southwest. Occasionally I'll see them in the ethnographies for waterbird and rain. Down in the Zapoteca, Marcus and Flannery suggested that they could be sacrificed. Our turkeys could be sacrificed. And it's hard to say because I don't see anything in the zoological data at Paquimé, but they're important iconographically. They may be related to sacrifice like the Zapotecas. Casas Grandes has a lot of turkeys that are ritually sacrificed. And if I cross my eyes and look at a couple of ceramic vessels, I might have turkeys. They're just not appearing in the Casas Grandes ceramic iconography, even though we have hundreds of them at the site of Paquimé. So we're just looking at this aspect of Casas Grandes local knowledge with a look toward the pottery. But here's a case of maybe sacrifice, maybe rain. Ducks. We have ducks, and these occur fairly regularly in the museums across Mexico and into the Americas, North America, and into Canada. The ducks, these are water birds, and no doubt about it, right? Because they land on water. Historically, many of the ethnographic groups in the Southwest likened them to water, and they're important water birds. And we have them. What's really fascinating when you're trying to look at iconography and you're trying to match its archaeological context to bring it meeting from the insider view, not looking at what's going on iconographically in different groups in the American Southwest. So try and understand these things on their own right. The house of the Walking Well had a lot of the wild birds interred in it. And this is straight out of the De Peso volumes, but most of the birds were intentionally interred at Paquimé. And 54% of them were macaws, 36.9 were turkeys, and 9.1 were wild birds. Of the wild birds, so the ducks and the owls were found in the House of the Walking Well. The House of the Walking Well is also fascinating because it also found there also were interred bobcats and bison. So bison was really important to the people of the Casas Grandes world. And at Paquimé and De Peso and his colleagues said that that was the #1 food resource. We just don't see in the iconography. So there's a lot of stuff going on at Paquimé that's just not making its way into the ceramic iconography. But anyway, the House of the Walking Well has a lot of these wild bird burials. Snakes. Let's talk a little bit about snakes. David Phillips, a mentor of mine, and he was on my dissertation committee, and I worked for him as a contract archaeologist before I went to grad school. He once said with a big smile, maybe the potters got the idea of this polychrome business from the snakes. I like that. You can see where Dave suggested that with a smile, and I would suggest that a smile. We have a sayings here in North America, red touch yellow, kill a fellow. And on the left-hand slide, you can really see that. You can see the banding where red touch yellow, that's symbolizing the coral snake. that is venomous. If you antagonize it a lot, you can probably be killed by it. It's kind of a shy snake. It doesn't really want to be pestered too much. But then we have this other red, white, and black snake, mountain king snake, and red touch black, friend of Jack. And these are all over the iconography. Both of these types of snakes are occurring in the ceramic iconography in all the different museums. The one on the bottom, the mountain king snake vessel, that's actually was found at Paquimé. The INA has made replicas of these, and you can buy a replica of that particular snake vessel. At least you could in the early 2000 to about mid 2010 or around there, but really beautiful vessels. We also, shouldn't surprise us, have Western diamondback rattlesnakes. So in the late 1990s, I asked the state herpetologist of New Mexico to help me identify different type of creatures on the pottery. We looked at snakes and other stuff. It's like, oh yeah, that's definitely a Western diamondback. You can tell it has a rattle. The diamonds are not always diamonds. They can look like triangles. They can look like circles and speckling. But on this vessel, we have basically, we'll call the triangles diamonds. We have that pattern of the skin and the speckling and the rattle, but you also have that viper's head, very distinctive triangular viper's head on this vessel. What's really interesting when we think about classification and clustering is that you have a coral snake. And so you have the snake coral band, but you have that viper's bulbous head, which the coral snake does not have. It has a very sleek, narrow head. What we think is happening is we have under differentiation to categories of venomous snake. So if you're teaching people or you're classifying things or you're learning about your environment, you say, yeah, things you have to worry about that are venomous have this triangular bulbous head. It has these type of snake band patterns, and it will have a rattle on it as a classification system for snakes. This is at another museum in El Paso. And this is a case where I think the bottom of the vessel is showing the coral snake having a rattle. So these are the different ways you can cluster venomous snakes, are these classification characteristics. Do you want to add anything to that, Todd?
No, just the idea that there's there are the snakes out there and they know what the snakes look like. And these aren't mistakes. It's not as if somebody didn't realize that the coral snakes have these thin heads compared to the rattlesnake. Rather, they intentionally chose to depict that viper head on the coral snake for the purpose of indicating the coral snake is venomous. And so it's clustering two animals we would hold apart into a single category of venomous snakes.
And it's meaningful, and it makes sense to them, and that's how they're going to use these characteristics to understand their natural world and their book taxonomy. Let's talk a little bit about miscellaneous creatures that occasionally appear in ceramic iconography. There's a lot of little bit and pieces. These do not occur in every museum collection. They do not always occur in the excavations at Paquimé either. But we have lots of fish. Excavations at Villa Mata in Chihuahua by Rafael Cruz Antillon and Timothy Maxwell have shown that people are eating a lot of fish at Villa Mata. Interestingly, the one on the bottom is Villa Mata, but with the Villa Mata polychromes are not being made at Villa Mata with this way to do it. But so we have lots of fish. I haven't keyed these out. I'm going to be a really good master thesis for somebody who's keying out the different fish and see if we can do it. I think there is what we consider a mud puppy at the Ameren, but that would be interesting to have somebody look at some of the collections at the Ameren. Bighorn sheep. These are all over rock art. One of my friends, Margaret Barrier, has written extensively about bighorn sheep. They're really important for a variety of reasons, but we're finding them. This is Villa Mata polychromes too. And what's interesting iconographically is, again, the double headeds coming out of the vessels, but also interlocking black and red design, this idea of dualities, both within how the red and black paint gets put on, but also dual heads. And I had to throw the little small one from the Laboratory of Anthropology up in Santa Fe. These are just really spot on mountain sheep. And we know that because of the big, the horns off of them, very diagnostic of what's showing up in the rock art too. We might even say one-to-one correspondence. Badgers. These are ferocious little guys. They might be symbolically related to guarding in their homes and nesting. They were valued. These are also appearing in the iconography of the Casas Grandes world. Horned lizard. There is a really large multi-level burial at Paquimé and the House of the Dead. It has a Casas Grandes brownware that has a horned lizard in it. So we have one case at Paquimé where it's occurring in a very interesting superimposed level of humans on top of each other, and it has a horned lizard. They're really rare. These are about all I have. I think I have one other one that I've photographed, but yeah, horned lizard, horny toads. Really interesting. Shamans like them because they split blood when they're out of their eyes when they're being threatened. So there's seems to be for California Indians, and in Mexico, many of the Mesoamerican groups liken it to shamanic belief systems. Turtles. I thought coming out of the American Southwest, having studied a lot with and looking at ethnographies, that we'd have a lot of turtles in the iconography. These are really rare. They're hard to find. I was just stunned by that because turtles are used for rattles and their capris are used for all kinds of rituals. There are a lot of reasons to have turtles. Furthermore, people at Paquimé went up into Sonora, grabbed mud turtles, and then put them in the canals. And so there are 17 mud turtles that were identified at Paquimé in the excavated areas, which Todd and I have suggested is related to water symbolism and water creatures at the site as a build water ceremonial center. So when I asked Charlie Painters, the New Mexico State herpetologist, to look up this stuff, the first thing he said was, wow, that looks like a snapping turtle, maybe a mud turtle. It's a turtle, and so it's kind of both macaw and both turtle, which might be because we think the macaws are sunbirds, rainbirds, and being used for a rainmaking ritual, and maybe that they're clustering turtles and macaws in quite a way. And turtles do have quite the snapping apparatus, I would say, just like macaws. You don't really want your fingers in their mouth. So maybe there's something to that. But again, these type of associations that don't necessarily make sense from a Linnaeus. Thank you, Linnaeus. I get all excited. I love this stuff. It's really fun. It's hard to talk just to a computer by yourself. It's kind of wonky. It's like talking to students that don't raise their hand and they're like dead. So please bear with us if we're talking just to our computer screen. I also thought we would find more bears in iconography. In North America and through Eurasia, bears are really important for medicine, and all kinds of rituals go around bears. This is the only one from Paquimé that might be a bear. I don't know if you can see my cursor, but there's from a ceramic effigy, just the head of the bear is there. This walk-in well is also where we found all the 9.1 wild birds. Most of them are in the walk-in well. This goes deep down into the earth, into the well. People may have dropped artifacts in it as a offering, like a cenote, or De Peso thought maybe as the site was being burned that somebody dropped a bag of goodies and they rolled down the stairs. William Walker and myself are more inclined to think these are offerings and religious significance. Regardless, it has a bear there. I keep thinking bear. When I saw this at the Ambrin, I'm like, oh, he's a chubby little guy. I just kept thinking a bear. And he would say, well, it's red. Yes, it's red. So De Peso and colleagues noted that Plius red and Ramos black had a lot of the same characteristics. And he thought that red could be substituted for black. This is in volume 6 of the Ambrin's publications. Just an idea, maybe, perhaps, a bear.
Excellent. So here we're talking some about some of Rachel's work, but she's been looking at the groundstone and looking at these effigies. And so here we're looking at a certain type of effigy. These are the standalone effigies, so sculptures of these critters. And we've got basically two types. We've got these large, and they're not necessarily particularly large, but we've got these large effigies that don't have perforated holes in them. We've got smaller effigies that have perforated holes in them that could be worn on clothing or attached to a bow or an arrow or something like that. What's interesting here is that there's very little overlap in terms of what is being depicted on the stone effigies compared to what's being depicted on the ceramics. About half of the stone effigies are depicting mountain lions. If you add in mountain lions and bears, that's over half. That's the majority of the stone effigies. So what's really being focused on with the stone effigies are these prey animals and predator animals. This is an example. You can see there the mountain sheep with its horn and the perforated hole there. This could be used as a bead affixed to clothing or a necklace or bow and arrow or something like that. A lot of these pictures are coming from this volume Paquimé, which was put out by a bank, my recollection is, in Nuevo Casas Grandes.
1981.
1981. It's got beautiful photographs, but it's a hard thing to come by. But if you are so interested, it's a lot of fun and it's worth getting hold of if you
And
can.
the beads like this, a mountain lion is about this, or a mountain sheep's about this big. Yeah.
Just they're quite small. Here's some more examples of effigies from that book I was just showing you.
And the Amarin has the one on the far left on display.
So we've got various sorts of animals that are being reflected here. There's this sort of hand axe thing off to the far right. We're not talking about those sorts of critters. Now, Rachel is going to look at those as part of her analysis, and we're just at early days of her analysis. We haven't looked at those yet. Those seem to be occurring in kind of ritual context, and so we're not talking about those. When we're talking about the effigies, we're talking about the other stuff. So not that kind of hand axe thing, but the other stuff. There on the top is an effigy of a worm. That's what De Peso suggested. Maybe it's a snake, maybe it's a worm. It certainly looks like it has a tubular body. De Peso suggested those little grooves in it, though, were reflecting the movement of the worm as it wiggled along. And again, this is really quite small. It's a big picture of a small artifact. Going down, you see that beautiful copper turtle, which is an effigy, but not one of the stone effigies. I just included here because it's pretty doggone neat. Then you see a little bear effigy next to it. Below that, you see a human-headed effigy with a macaw on the other end. We suggest that this is reflecting the macaw-based shamanism that we see at Paquimé as part of the flower world shamanism, more typical across Mesoamerica and on up into the American Southwest. Then over on the side, you can see a couple of bird effigies that are quite nice. These are things that were recovered by De Peso at Paquimé. So when we look at these, we see that there's different content and different places these are occurring compared to the pottery, suggesting that these effigies are being made by different makers and users for probably different purposes. We also see the majority of these items are coming from a manufacturing location in Unit 8, it's room 15. But we have previously argued that there's specialized production of stone artifacts. Gordon Rakita and Rafael Cruz have a nice discussion of the economic organization specialization at Paquimé. John Topai also has some interesting research on specialized production at Paquimé. Yeah, we think that it's entirely possible that these stone artifacts, these stone effigies, are actually being made by specialists at Paquimé at this particular location. But the point here is that we're not finding this stuff where it was used. Instead, we're finding it primarily from the place where it was being manufactured and from places where it's been discarded or perhaps lost out in plaza areas. But we're not really finding these in, say, ceremonial context or any sort of special caches or any place that might reflect a particular use. They're either lost or discarded, or they're in the process of being manufactured. So what do we have here? Well, the mountain lion is considered to be the quintessential hunter in the Southwest. Many of the Southwestern pueblos actually name their hunting societies after the mountain lion. The effigies are used as aids by the hunters. There are lots of oral traditions in which these effigies will actually come alive, act as mountain lions, and help the hunters in various ways, help them capture game or protect them in some way. The effigies of mountain lions are frequently affixed amongst the Native Americans of the Southwest to bows, to arrows, to clothing. After a kill, a lot of times they're dipped into the blood of the prey animal, the deer, whatever, so that the mountain lion effigy can eat. This will bring luck to the hunter and help the hunter be a good hunter, just like a mountain lion. Bear is also an important being that can cause or cure sickness amongst the Dene and the various pueblos. A lot of times bear effigies are part of healing kits. They're used as part of healing ceremonies. And so these are examples of these sorts of critters that can be used to, it's a form of sympathetic influence, where these sorts of little stone effigies can be used to kind of bring focus or bring good luck into a context where people are attempting to accomplish a particular goal. Absolutely. And so in addition to these, we also have these sorts of liminal creatures. Now, we have creatures in Western traditions that are not real creatures, things like the Pegasus or the unicorn. There never was a winged horse. By the same token, there are certain sorts of creatures that seem to be fanciful. Now, they're not fanciful in the same way that a Pegasus might be, in that sometimes these sorts of creatures might be the sorts of creatures that are real. They're just not readily visible in the natural world. You don't come across them while you're walking down a path, but they're actually real in a Native American perspective. So we do get these sorts of creatures. So here we have a bird with human feet. There's no bird that ever lived that actually had human feet in the sense of the sort of bird that you go along and you have as a macaw or a pet or something like that. But these can still be very significant as considered real creatures, creatures that are actually influencing human life and are present within the environment.
They're usually associated with females and shown on the chest of females, these type of birds. Keep going. Yeah, thank you.
So here's another case. This is a macaw-headed serpent. Again, there's no designated species of a serpent that has a macaw head. That just isn't one of the sorts of snakes we find in the Southwest. But here we have plumed serpents, serpents with wings, serpents with horns, serpent with macaw heads that were very important to the folks in the Medio period. These are liminal creatures that reflect as painted images, whereas the physical creatures, things like the macaws, are depicted as effigies, as Christine was previously mentioning. Do you wish to add anything?
No, you're good.
All right. So our conclusions. A lot of times we do see a one-to-one correspondence in both the ceramics and the stone effigies, where we can pick up as effigy and say, hey, this reflects this particular animal that we would also recognize using the exact same characteristics. But we also see animals that are clustered into larger categories. For example, the rattlesnake and the coral snake clustering into the category of venomous snakes. We also see mud turtles and macaws possibly falling into a category of water creatures or creatures that are related to fertility and the abundance of water. We also see that the pottery and the stone effigies reflect different aspects of local knowledge. Now, the pottery focuses on creatures that are liminal in some sense. There are lots of birds, lots of snakes. Birds live in the air, snakes live underneath the ground. This is all linked to flower world-based shamanism, we suggest, and it's all part of a cognitive, ceremonial, cosmological system focused on fertility and water. In contrast, the stone effigies that we've looked at thus far reflect major predator and prey animals, likely associated with hunting and possibly warfare. These things are more practical in the sense of there's the sorts of things that people would wear for, like good luck charms, for immediate benefits to help them achieve particular goals over the course of their day. We also see a gendered component, with men being associated with snakes and women with birds. We didn't talk that much about it here, but we've discussed this more in print. And based on ethnographic analogy, it's very likely that the stone effigies were related to masculine activities, especially hunting and warfare. Christine, would you like to add anything?
I'm good. Thank you.
So we'd be happy to answer any questions that people would like to have. And we sure appreciate the opportunity to speak with you.
So we've got lots.
Oh, good.
Here's one from Patrick. Because the Viejo period is so Mogollon-like, should Casas Grandes be considered part of the Mogollon world, albeit with Mesoamerican infusion? Or do the Mesoamerican influence make Casas Grandes so distinct that it should be considered its own separate culture?
That is an excellent question. Historically, Southwestern archaeologists had based the cultural areas on pottery. So Mogollon people were brownware pottery people, while Casas Grandes has a lot of brownware vessels. Even the ramos, why we tend to think of it white, are a light cafe, as my colleagues in Mexico say, cafe con leche, so coffee with milk. It's definitely a brownware phenomenon. So on that level, I'm happy calling it Mogollon. And in our books and our writings, what we say is that it's still Mogollon with like a cake surface, with the elites playing into Mesoamerica. So we see it as local grown with a veneer of Mesoamerica that's doing important things for elites. But I think if you were to go and talk to the average potter, probably female back in the day, probably would identify more with the Mogollon world, but then the males with their rituals are as more Mesoamerican. Todd.
Absolutely, I agree with everything that Christine just said. It's also worth keeping in mind that Paquimé is kind of unusual, and so there's a whole lot of sites out across the landscape that look like more or less like any Mogollon site you might find up in the El Paso area or on over towards Silver City. So Paquimé is different, but Paquimé is different within the region as well as different across the regions. And so it's probably not, yes, there's a definite Mogollon basis there to the Casas Grandes region. And I would agree that it's part of the Mogollon, the larger Mogollon culture.
Did we answer your question, Patrick?
He won't be able to tell us.
Oh, that's true. Sorry.
Yeah. So here's another from Eric about ducks. Several of the duck effigies at Amarin have 4 feet. How common is that depiction in this type of effigies curated at other museums where you have conducted research?
Very common. I probably have, at least guessing off my head without number crunching, 7 to 8. What's interesting about the ducks, and I didn't talk about all of them this time, is a lot of them have teeth. And so there's something more symbolically. So yes, they have 4 legs and they have teeth. And so this is going to sound bad. I don't mean to, but they're kind of like were ducks, right? There's something a little different. They have extra legs and they have teeth. And so I think this is something cosmological, something meaningful. And it is weird because that may be one of the places where the idea of spirit creatures only being painted, we might have a physical manifestation of a duck-like creature, but that has 4 legs and teeth. Does that answer your question? I'm sorry, I shouldn't ask that, but yes. So to answer your question, very common.
We used to joke about these as duck dogs,
yes,
because
duck dogs.
but
Yeah.
obviously they're not. But it was like, wow, this looks like a duck dog.
Yeah, so there's something related probably into that semantics classification system with the ancient people at Paquimé.
One from Joyce. Is it typical that the macaw effigies have depictions of the dot in a square motif and the owls have interlocked rectilinear scrolls? If so, do you have any ideas on why and or the meaning?
That is a great question. So the macaws with the squares with dots and the circle with dots, a lot of that can be read as corn and corn symbolism. So rainbirds, sunbirds bringing rain to make sure your crops are growing is symbolically related. Their interlocking scrolls are a little more challenging. Some people, if you were Hopi, so one time Michael Cabote told me those are serpents. I'm like, okay, serpents are good. And so there may be some type of water symbolism even within your mountain sheep that are showing that relationship. Mountains are where clouds build in the Southwest. And so anything that is highland could be associated with the clouds. So if I was to take a Hopi sensibility based on Michael Cabote's work, I would say that those are probably related to horned serpents, of those type of semantics with the mountain sheep that come from upper lands in the clouds, literally.
And here's a question from Claudia. You kind of answered a little bit of it, but do you consult with tribes in developing your conclusions about the meaning and significance of these items?
I would like to do more of that. I have, back when Michael Cabote was alive, he was one of the people that was so willing to talk with us and spend days. I spent days in 2 different sessions, one for the AAA's, the American Anthropological Association. He was in a session with me. And then also the Society for American Archaeology meetings, and we spent a lot of time talking. Yes, I would like to do more of that, but when possible, we do, like with Michael Cabote.
One of the things, though, is, as one would expect, there isn't a single Native American perspective, and so you get 3 Native American folk into the room with you, and you show them a picture. They very frequently have 3 very different sort of reactions to the picture in terms of interpretations or what oral traditions it might fit to, and whatnot. And so it's a lot of fun, but sometimes it's very confusing as well. And so we very much like working with Native Americans, especially as their interests cause them to want to work with us. But even when we're using things like oral traditions, a lot of times it's hard to fix particular ideas onto the archaeological record in a way that is generally acceptable to the Native Americans we've worked with.
Right, and Paquimé is a little bit challenging too, because we don't know where the people went after Paquimé is abandoned. It could be Tarahumara. Hopi has claimed it as an ancestral site. Paquimé, because it was the largest city in that region, it was probably multi-ethnic, multi-language is our guess. And so there are lots of ways to read these, and lots of different groups definitely have the rights to interpret these things for sure. It just means that there are lots of ways to pull on this from its multi-ethnic perspective, as a full city would be today in America, where you have cities like Albuquerque or Tucson that have a lot of different groups. Probably the same was true of Paquimé.
Yeah. Okay, and probably the last one that we have time for, from Jeff, to expolate on Patrick's question. Has your pottery, stone effigies research identified possible overlap with the ancestral Pueblo and Chacoan or Hohokam cultures?
Yes and no. I know those are not good question or good answer. Yes, there's a lot of stuff with the Mogollon base that we can really see it. And it looks like for at least the horn plume serpents, they go up to Pottery Mountain and straight into Zuni, morphologically speaking. So we have a lot of that continuity. We have these small curious birds on Paquimé stuff that sometimes look very Hohokam. The stone effigies fit at least what's been written in the ethnographic record, and I'll let Todd fill that side of it more.
Well, so yes, there are a lot of similarities across the Southwest amongst a lot of different groups. There's also differences. We anticipate that Paquimé in particular, and the Casas Grandes region in general, will have some meaningful similarities. And so, for example, with stone effigies, Cushing found that bear and mountain lion effigies were by far the most common effigies at Zuni, and those are the same effigies we find common at Paquimé. So that does suggest that there's probably some similarities. By the same token, there are certainly going to be differences in the same way that you go to any particular group of people, the Tohono O'odham versus Akmel O'odham, or you go to any of the various pueblos. There are going to be differences amongst the various groups in the Southwest, and just as there are differences between the modern people in Southwest, there are going to be also differences amongst the prehistoric folk in the Southwest. And so it is the sort of thing where a lot of times ethnographic analogies can provide great insights, even as we recognize that there are going to be some differences that are present in the way that the people are interacting with the material record.
Thank you. I think we're about out of time. I'm going to let you sign off, and I apologize and thank everyone for your patience for the rough start. And I will let you two sign off. Thank you again.
Thank you so much.
Thank you all. It's a great time, and we wish you all a good week.